The Sustainable Voice, bringing you big successes from small places worldwide.
Welcome back, Leigh. Welcome back, everybody. Welcome to the latest episode of Sustainable Voice. How are you doing?
I am great, thank you. I got a little bit of a late start this morning, so I'm still working through my coffee, but ready to chat and happy to be here with you.
I got
How
my
about you?
coffee as well. I'm good to go. I'm all set. So yeah, it's there, and we got an exciting topic today. We've been focusing on Latin America quite a bit, but and Egypt and Latin America, but now we're shifting to South Africa, aren't we?
Yeah, we are, and I'm excited to hear about this because I know you have well, I mean, of course, obviously you have a passion about everything in Africa, but I really, having connected with you over the past few years when you were speaking about South Africa, I really loved your insight. And so I'm excited to dive deeper into that.
I thought you were gonna say, well, I think you have an opinion on this. Me have an opinion? No, come on.
See, all I know about you in South Africa is your motorcycle escapades that you've spoken of.
Yes.
So,
Well, the motorcycle escapades. Well, next door in Namibia, I have to tell you, there's a gentleman who runs a philanthropy organization that every year I see him, every year we have a beer together.
mhm.
And some of the listeners know who this person is. Because I was in the middle of a desert in Namibia and I had actually ended up breaking my finger. I didn't even know it. I didn't even know I'd broken my finger. I was on an ATV and had a mishap with the ATV.
How do
Didn't
you
even
not
know.
know? How do you not know that
You,
did it
it's
not hurt?
well, no, it hurt, but I was more in shock about what happened at the ATV,
Oh,
and then more concerned about the fact that I was, 2 hours from the city, wondering whether I was gonna get home or become dinner for what was in the desert.
ah, okay.
So, I mean, it was there, but so the gentleman came with his truck and happened to be driving through. He's like, "You need a ride back?" I go, "Funny enough, I do." So I didn't know that on the plane home, my finger started hurting and I couldn't figure out what it was. And then I got
Mhm.
back and I started feeling the bottom of my finger, and it was a very small break, right? It was tiny, so not the finger itself wasn't mangled,
Yeah.
but it was a very small bone that had turned inward, and so you felt this sharp object in the bottom of my finger. So I went to the doctor, and they go, "We have to break your finger again." I go, "Break my finger?" I go, "I've already broken it." "Well, we have to reset it." I'm like, "I'll forget that. Never mind. We'll be fine." So I just
So
sat there
you,
and squeezed it, and I heard it, and then it just broke.
Ashish, you broke
Yeah,
it again yourself,
pretty
or you just
much.
finished the break, or what?
I didn't know I was breaking it, but apparently I did. I ended up going to the doctor anyway afterwards. They go, "Well, nothing more can do. It looks like you already did break it again." I'm like, "Well, so is it there?" He's like, "Well, you're gonna have bone spurs." I'm like, "Yeah, all right, good." They go, "Well, you're
Lord.
gonna have bone spurs there." I go, "Well, let me add that to the joints. Let me add that to the list of places I've got bone spurs." So
Oh my gosh.
I'm used to it. If
Yeah,
it
yeah.
if it's not falling off or if it's not killing me, then we're good to go. Just put a band-aid and keep going.
Is that whole thing what kills you makes you stronger? I don't know. I
No,
don't think that's what it
mine's throw some
what
dirt on it and keep going.
what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Mine's it's just blood. Put some dirt on it. You're good to go.
You'll be fine. You'll
Yeah,
be
that's
fine.
it. Exactly.
Well, when did you first go to South Africa? How old were you when you
I
first
was a
South Africa?
teenager. I was a
Yeah.
teenager when I went the first time, and that's a little bit older teenager. I've always been enamored by it, right? I've always
Hmm.
been intrigued by it just because of the fact that it's something that's always gotten to me. I've always been intrigued by the history. I grew up learning about people like Steve Biko, learning about, of course, Mandela. And I was always intrigued by people who, even in the West, who saw Mandela as a terrorist
Mm.
versus what he was. I don't try to correct them or argue with them because there's enough rhetoric out there to go one way or the other. And that's really what it comes down to. So what I noticed though in that country, so I'll tell you. So it was 1994. It was the Rugby World Cup. I was actually, and that's right before I'd gone for the first time. So 1994, it was the Rugby World Cup, and obviously that's what the famous movie Invictus is based on, which is by the
Hmm.
way, great movie. I was a junior in high school. And I was learning about world history and getting into this and really just intrigued by it. And I've always been in love with history. You know this. I've always been a history.
Yeah.
I'm just a nerd when it comes to this
Yeah.
stuff. So I was always going in. Of course, the whole notion of anti-apartheid was something that I didn't understand.
Hmm.
Coming from Kenya, dealing with racism in the U.S. and whatnot, and then seeing that this is a way of life, and I kept thinking, like, I thought we were past this, and then understanding that it was a function of life and a function of what it was, and um, so just reading, and then I actually met somebody who was when I went to university, I became friends with somebody who was a visiting student from South Africa, and
Hmm.
this was in 1997. And started getting to talk to him, and he was telling me about what it was like. And he was from Johannesburg. He was telling me what it was like, and he was explaining about his parents. His father was a police officer, explaining everything else. The way his father was forced to follow rules, and he wasn't Caucasian.
Mm.
He was black. He was South African, and talking about just the elements. But then he kept talking about the African National Congress. He kept talking about Mandela. He kept talking about this, and I knew who Mandela was at the time. Everybody knew who Mandela was in
Yeah.
94. And he put the country on the map in terms of just a unified beacon. And what he mentioned to me there, because I was infatuated by him, and we would talk for hours, and he would tell me about the fact that just the fact that he said in all his life, and he said his father told him this, he has never seen a country unified behind one thing, especially South Africa. He's never seen his country unified behind one thing. And a lot of people think
Mm.
that it was behind Mandela. It wasn't. It was behind the ideology. Mandela was just the face to that ideology, and he was the
Oh,
he was the
interesting.
vehicle to that ideology, but it
Yeah.
was the ideology. And I because I asked about that. I said, well, everybody gravitates towards Mandela. He goes, no, he goes, yes, they do, but he is not the mechanism. He is a vehicle for that mechanism. He's a vessel.
Mm.
And it's an interesting choice of words that he used. So then fast forward to my senior year of university. So this was 1999. I had a professor, and I blogged about this recently. I had a professor who changed my life. I mean, everybody has one of those teachers. I was lucky
Yeah.
enough to have two or three.
Yeah.
But this professor was part of the national security team for Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, and the first section of Reagan. So you
Wow.
think about
Yeah.
every single international incident, he was in the Oval Office.
That's
He's showing
amazing.
us declassified images from the South China Seas, declassified images about 3 rows of ICBMs and everything else. And gosh, I was ready to take the civil services exam. I almost did.
Yeah.
Talking to him just
Hmm.
because my goal was to be in finance, and then after just hanging on his every word, he was actually helping me fill out the application because the goal was for me to go work in one of our embassies,
Hmm.
and to basically be a diplomat,
Wow.
and work in those ways. So South Africa came up. So we had talked, for example, as a sidebar, we had talked about Chile. Now,
Yeah.
it's common knowledge now, but at the time he was showing us declassified information about Chile, for example, telling us about how, Pinochet's party, the US government wanted Pinochet's party to be in power in Chile when they came in
Hmm.
73, but they didn't want him.
Mm.
And that wasn't known at the time. It is obviously common knowledge now. So the topic of South Africa came up, and I'm listening to him. Now, mind you, I want to tell you about the people I'm sitting next to, right? I'm sitting next to my study partner who is from South Korea. I'm
Hmm.
sitting across on this side to another study partner who is from Kenya. And then I'm sitting in front row with study partners that are from the US, from Canada, from Europe. And it was basically International Economics 301 or something like that. I forget the name of the
Okay.
class.
I
But anyway,
wondered what this. Yeah.
yeah, it was a 301 level class,
Uh-huh.
but it was absolutely this was the class. I don't care how many midterms I had. I don't care how late I was up till. At one point I was pulling a 48-hour all, nonstop. I was up for 48 hours. I had taken a nap for 5 minutes here and there because of midterms and everything else. And I was wide awake for his class. His was the class that I was there early.
Yeah.
I was there
Wow. Love
early.
that.
Oh,
Yeah.
and I mean, you compare it. I showed up to accounting wearing my pajamas. Uh, you know.
Sheesh, all I managed to make it to on time in college was racquetball and sailing team. So I'm impressed that you were
I,
passionate to show up for a 301 international economics class.
I mean, it's amazing. You know what? I tell you something, because I was the same boat. My freshman year was all about racquetball and everything else. My
Yeah.
freshman year, I had a professor for Econ 101. And by the time, you know, you have professor, he was one of the other professors that changed my life, because by the time you get to, you know, you start getting into a topic. By the time I was on that 301 level, the junior or senior in college, I was grading econ papers with the dean of business
Hmm.
school. I was
Yeah.
grading 101 econ papers, and it was just, oh, it was, I wasn't even a teaching assistant, but I was still grading the papers.
Yeah.
You know, I needed to get tuition money from somewhere.
Yeah. Yep.
So that was it.
How we
So
do it.
that's exactly it. But then we got to, you know, just this topic, and you look back, and you know, he told me his story about he was in the Oval Office, and it came full circle in 2004. That was George Bush's second term, right? 2004. He appointed a new economics advisor to his team, to his cabinet.
Mm,
One of the people he appointed was my econ professor from my
that's so
freshman year
cool.
at college. It was him. So I messaged him right
Wow.
away and I said, "Are you serious?"
Wow.
And
That's so
it
cool.
was, you know, I didn't hear back. I didn't expect to hear back, but it was my
Yeah.
econ professor from my freshman
Yeah.
year of college. And there I see him on TV, and I go, I know that guy. And there he is. And, you know, I'm like, it's the
That's so
next
cool.
Larry Summers. Look at this, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a short term, but it was so cool. So, of course, then I see this guy in 301 talking about how he was in the Oval Office when President Kennedy was assassinated. He was in the Oval
Mm,
Office when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened, when the Bay, you know, Bay of Pigs, when everything happening in Taiwan, the ICBMs, everything else, the even going to, you know, when we got into the oil crisis, the OPEC, everything else, Vietnam, I mean, you name it, every terrorist attack, everything else. He was there at the very beginning of the movement for the fall of communism. You know, the fall of the Berlin Wall. He wasn't
wow.
around. He wasn't in the Oval Office, obviously, when it fell, but he was there when the movement started.
Mm-hmm.
He was there,
Mm-hmm.
and God,
Interesting.
it was incredible. And so we were talking about South Africa,
Yeah.
and he said that what he said to me. He said that the position of the U.S. government is what he was telling me. Again, I can't verify this, so I'm sure somebody who has more intel than me will be able to either corroborate it or completely knock it to dirt. You know, so the main thing that I think is really key is he was talking about this notion that the government and the standing government had actually started turning. That the foreign he focused his conversation on foreign investment. He focused the conversation on now South Africa was starting to look for foreign investment. They weren't looking for money to borrow. They were looking for foreign investment. They were trying to join a global economy, right? The term global economy was just starting to become a thing in the 90s
Mm,
with
mm-hmm.
e-commerce and everything else. They were simply trying to join the global trade mechanism, right? They were trying to join the global economy. So, and he said something that my friend said as well. He said, everybody in that country, again, you've got obviously people that are going to sway from this, but for the majority, everybody in that country was rowing in the same direction. And I said, so
Oh.
I went to see him. I said, what does that mean? I said, this isn't a class. He goes, look, he goes, what does it tell you about, again, not a person, but an ideology? That the very people who didn't agree with the ideology now not only accepted it, but started seeing that if we wanted to become part of the international scene or the international community,
Mm-hmm.
we were going to have to go this other way. And the fear, he said, was that at some point they were going to be economically colonized. Now, by who? At the time, nobody knew, right? But
Yeah.
you think about what was happening in the world during this time when this course was happening. There was a currency crisis in Asia. The Thai baht had completely collapsed, and it was threatening to take the entire region with it. This is where Alan Greenspan was adjusting interest rates and protecting us and telling us he was protecting us by keeping rates low and whatnot. And you imagine that, right? That was happening. We of course had, we had the incursion back into Iraq. That was happening,
Mm-hmm.
or at least in the starts of it, right?
Yeah.
We had the incident in Somalia during that time of U.S. troops on the ground in Somalia. So he was talking about this, and the the African continent, and all the nations in Africa were not seen as the focus of investment the way they are today, right? They weren't seen that way. You look at places like Senegal today. It's tourism hotspot, but you look back then. No, 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 no. West Africa. Who wants to go there? No, 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 no. South Africa was that same boat. He was talking about the fact that nobody would touch South Africa, and as a result, all the neighboring countries, right, all the neighboring countries that were there, which have since changed names and whatnot, they were also in the same boat, meaning that they also were subjected to being alienated in the international community.
Hmm.
So he said you saw everybody come together, whether it was the African National Congress, whether it was Mandela with his ideology, but they came together with this focus of becoming part of the international community. And tourism was just starting at that point. It was just
Okay.
became a thing at that point, right? It was okay. Now it's pretty much, I mean, I draw a parallel to South Africa to Venezuela, right? At that point, right now we're waiting for Venezuela. Like, okay, this could be the beginning of a movement there, or like Colombia was. South
Yeah.
Africa was in that place. Like, okay, here we are.
Yeah.
It started really coming full circle. So he was talking about the dialogues. He started talking about the conversations diplomats were having. He started talking about when the embassy was being opened in South Africa, the U.S. embassy, and when relations were starting to be. You got to remember, he was talking about the fact that we had sanctions on South Africa before all this.
Yeah.
Strong sanctions. The fact that you had relations becoming normalized because of this. You had Mandela in New York at the United Nations giving a talk about foreign investment. And he actually played that speech for us. Now, a clip of it was used in that movie Invictus, but he played the whole speech for us because he was sitting in the what do you call it, the bleacher seats, listening to that in that
gallery
room, in the gallery. He was
Yeah.
in the gallery listening to it, and he was telling us, "Look, this is what he was saying. This is
Wow.
why he was there." And he said what people saw was him talking. What they didn't see was among the rows of all the delegates from different countries. For the first time, he said he didn't see people going, "Who is this? Why is
Oh.
this person here?"
Hmm.
You think about it, right? When you've had people addressing the United Nations, you've had all sorts of dissentment, right? You've had people yelling things out. You've had people getting up to
Yeah.
protest. You've had people doing this. Not a word. You could have heard a pin drop in that
Hmm.
room, is what he was saying.
Yeah.
That's huge.
Yeah.
So and then of course you go forward from there, and you have the World Cup, the FIFA World Cup, and that image of Mandela holding up that trophy. And what ends up happening is a lot of people associate Mandela as the face of South Africa, good or bad. They associate him, right? His former home is now, or his temporary home is now turned into a hotel. Of course, the visits to Robben Island with the guards that were looking after him. There's obviously the separate side of it with Winnie Mandela, with his ex-wife, and
Yeah.
what she became and whatnot. So you start thinking about this. Now, go forward to 2012. I was at a luxury travel conference, and they have a surprise guest speaker. She's an author. I don't
Mm.
know who she is. She's an author. I don't know who she is. Nobody knows. All of a sudden, this woman comes out. She's wearing this colorful outfit, and it's South Africa's colors. And I go, "Who is this?" The translator comes out. She was Mandela's personal chef.
Oh,
And she
wow.
starts talking about this cookbook that she had just put together
Yeah.
and explain the dishes. And then she looks at me and she says, she comes to me and through a translator, she says, "You look Indian." I said, "I am." She said, "Most of my dishes have an Indian flavor to them because and she asked me where I was from. I said Kenya, so she called him Zay. She
Mm.
goes, part of my Zay's incarceration. And she said it obviously in her language was, and not even Afrikaans, her native tongue. She said part of his incarceration, an Indian family was looking after the kids. So she said Mandiba actually really enjoyed
Oh.
Indian flavored food. So of course, me, I'm like,
Yeah.
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 And then you listen to that, and I knew that already, but to hear it coming from her and the fact that she created this cookbook, and if you and the cookbook's available anyway, you can buy it online.
Yeah.
But I've read it, and I've gone through it. She gave me a copy of it, and I read through it. There's all these Indian dishes in there.
That's
So
so
it got me
cool.
really going. And I'm saying, oh my gosh, this is part of the international community. Then you fast forward to when did that, or even go backwards, when the story of Mahatma Gandhi really started coming out, right? So
Hmm.
this is in the 2000s. I know everybody talked about him in the 80s, but in the 2000s, it really came out. Well, now the story came out truly about him, the fact that he was practicing lawyer in Johannesburg before all this story about him in India. He was living in South Africa, in Johannesburg. He was practicing law there, and that was a huge part of it. She starts seeing these two worlds collide.
Yeah.
right? And then you start hearing all these things, and then you start seeing just this rocket that South Africa has become in terms
Yes.
of from a tourism standpoint. So much amazing work being done, whether it's preserving what the Zulu culture, whether it's actually getting into some of the preservation of animals, whether it's getting into, just different elements, rhino conservation, everything else. There's so much great work happening all over the country, right?
Hmm.
Places like Marataba, places, obviously like Kwandwe, places Balawango. Then there's all these areas that are just, and even Pinda, for example, doing great work, right? And you start thinking, this wasn't always this case. Now
Yeah.
it's getting here. And you saw this unification. And then Mandela passed away.
Hmm.
And now you start seeing the ANC fracturing. And this all came ahead. Was it last year or the year before? When was it that Jacob Zuma was put into prison? There was the ex-president that was arrested and put in jail. I think it was a few years back. And then
Hmm.
you started seeing dissension. You started seeing dissension in ways that I'm just not used to. And the one thing that ties the whole country together is tourism now, right? The one thing, you got mining of diamonds and everything else, but the one thing that ties the country together is tourism in all forms. And it's important, right? Because the fact that now you're dealing with corruption, which it's not that it wasn't there, it's just more prevalent now. It's not
Mm.
that it didn't exist, it's more prevalent, right? And a lot
Yeah.
of people look at some of the news now and go, oh my gosh, it's happening because Mandela's not there. That's not entirely true. The focus here becomes, okay, we needed to have South Africa enter the international community. Everybody in the country understood that. Whether you agreed with the end of apartheid or not, whether you agreed with Mandela or not, whether you agreed with the direction of the country, you understood that in order for the country to survive economically, the inclusion in the international trade community was a must.
Right.
Absolutely necessary. You're sitting on all these precious minerals like diamonds. The inclusion into the global community was an absolute must for the survival of the country to not go back to being a colony economically, I'm talking about, right? Or being a failed
Mhm.
state or becoming like a Somalia or becoming overrun, whatever form. Considering your neighbors, right? Considering who your neighbors are around South Africa at that time, not now, but at that time, it was important. Let's
2021. That's when
Yes, that's
Zuma
when it
was
was.
sentenced.
That's when it
Yeah.
was. So in the middle of COVID, middle of the pandemic,
Yeah.
right? And the
15
pandemic,
months. Yeah.
and you take a look now, 2021 is when that happened, but you take a look at the country now, they've come together, right? Again,
Hmm.
focusing on tourism. But the challenge then becomes, okay, where's your North Star now? Right? The North Star was inclusion in the international trade community. You're there. The inclusion, the North Star during the pandemic was, of course, to survive, to be able to come through whole or as whole as possible. That happened. Now talking about the heritage, but what's the next step?
Hmm.
What has to happen now, right? That becomes what's really key. So as a country, South Africa has to really look inwards now to say what is our the next North Star. Every leader in South Africa has to look at this and say what is our North Star. We can sit back and say, well, tourism is our lifeblood. It's growing and all's well, right? All's well. Okay, great. But take a look at some of the countries in the world that just did that and sat idly by
Yeah.
and look at what happened, right? Before Venezuela fell into disarray, there actually was a good amount of tourism
Mm.
that was going there.
Mm.
Obviously, it stopped, right? Colombia has a North Star with tourism, but they're also now looking at what their next vision is, right? From a sustainable
Hmm.
standpoint. South Africa has the ability to lead the way among nations. Whether it's through this new, their new BRICS collaboration, which I'm still skeptical of, or anything else. But
What
there's ways to lead the community, to lead the continent, and I
what's
think
what's the BRICS? Tell
so.
me.
BRICS is basically an attempt to form an alternate currency.
Okay.
So BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Brazil, Russia. What am I forgetting? BRICS. Yeah, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Yeah, BRICS. It's basically a coalition trying to form an alternate currency to create a platform for global commodities like oil to be traded in other currencies other than the dollar. I'm
Okay.
skeptical of it just because of the fact that much like the euro when it was formed, it was Germany paying everybody's bills, and the UK at the time when they were there. Now it's basically China and India paying everybody's bills.
Yeah. Mm.
And China's economy is in a whole separate mess, so which means India is paying everybody's bills.
Hmm.
So it's just it doesn't have that same connection to it. But
Mm.
it's basically an attempt to create an alternate trading platform, currency trading platform. A lot of people think it's about destabilizing the dollar. I don't know that I'd go that far.
Yeah.
But because you look at the people that the countries that are joining BRICS, it's all the poorest countries in the world that are joining.
But do
So
they poorest countries, but are they rich in you know,
oil and
sort of
minerals,
commodity? Yeah.
some, not all. It's I liken it to basically everybody with bad credit flocking to a dealership that accepts bad credit to buy a nice car. I
When
liken
you
it to
when you
that.
rattled off the countries, I thought that's a really random, strange
That's
group of
exactly right.
that's
I,
really
I mean, it's not as bad as what's being planned for Brazil and Argentina, which is El Sur. It's not as bad as that, but it's, I mean, at least it's there. I mean, the driving force here is, of course, Russia and China, and of
hmm.
course India part of it as well. But
Yeah.
I get the concept. Look, the dollar is not going to be a global reserve forever, and that's a separate conversation. Obviously,
Hmm.
it's not going to be the global reserve forever. At some point, another currency will take over. I mean, countries like India they're in the top five in terms of global economy. China's number two. Uh, the saying is that by 2050, India is going to be number one in terms of
Mm.
global economy. So the passage to have a new global reserve is there. It's going to take some time to do it. So that path
Yeah.
of the passage is there. And a lot of people look at that and say, what's the fall of the US? It's the fall of the US dollar. It's not the fall, it's evolution.
Yeah.
I mean, at one point, the British pound was a global reserve. It's the evolution. It's just the nature of it.
So
Um,
what else do you see on the horizon for South Africa? Do you see, that you said they don't have a North Star? Do you
yeah,
or that, do you see twinkles of anything there that gives you
tons,
any kind
tons.
of
There's so much potential, but they got to get out of their own way.
mm,
There's so much potential in terms of whether it's history, whether it's heritage, whether it's actually standing at you see something my professor talked about when we talked about South Africa in that class. He talked about this transformation of the country, right? And of course, we talked about the Rugby World Cup, and first, I think still only time, or might be one of the fewest times, that the host country won the Rugby World Cup, and they weren't supposed to even get past the
oh,
first round.
that
If you haven't, the movie's great, but you got to read this book.
oh,
You got to read the book. It's not called Invictus, and Invictus is named after it's a poem that
hmm.
Mandela used to read to himself when he was at Robben Island.
Hmm.
It's actually a great poem, and I think the last two phrases are one of my favorite. It's changed a little bit, but I think it's "I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." Something
Hmm.
like that.
Yeah.
It's a great ending. It's a very famous poem. But anyway, so the book talks about it's written by the captain of the Rugby World Cup team at the time, and he was talking about what the rugby team stood for. So
Hmm.
here there is now, when you look at all the countries in Africa, Nigeria and a lot of the countries in West Africa are now coming into the mix with tourism, right?
Hmm.
Senegal, other countries, there's now starting to be there. Nigeria has a ton of issues, but they're still starting to emerge in different ways. South Africa has the ability to lay a standard, but
Mm.
they've got to meet that standard themselves, right? They met that
Mm.
standard when it came to the fall of apartheid, but they've got to have a new
Mm.
standard when it comes to inclusion and evolution and focusing on tourism, embracing tourism, whether it's history. You go to places like Senegal, it's not about the wildlife, it's about the colonial history of the continent. And other countries in West Africa have the ability to actually tell those stories properly.
Mm.
Some of the best guerrilla trekking in the world can be done in Congo versus Uganda and Rwanda, but this is too much instability. So the ability for South Africa to really become the voice of a continent and to basically say, look, this is how we transform, replicate this, right? Replicate this. You've got Kenya, you've got Tanzania, you've got Egypt, you've got Morocco, but you got to remove Egypt and Morocco from that. Morocco is a monarchy. You got to remove Egypt from it because Egypt has its own system.
Mm.
But then you come down to the other countries. I'm thinking more so of a country like Sudan,
Mm.
right? Which is part of the African continent. It is part of the community, but nobody will touch it. And that one's close to me because of my family, right?
Sure.
My
Yeah.
mom's family. But you're talking about a civil war, a country that is broken into two. So now it's two countries. There's civil war happening in Sudan. South Sudan's already unstable. And the South Africa has the ability and the voice and the platform and the means to be able to bring to be able to bring stability to some of these countries,
Hmm.
to hold a standard for the nation, for the continent, for their nation, for the continent, and for every nation in that continent. And to draw it akin to, let's say, the EU, right?
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
take a look at the country during the last decade. You had with the acronym PIGS, right? Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Spain, and Greece, or
Hmm.
Greece and Spain. These are all the countries that were basically going broke.
Mm.
They were draining on the entire region, and then Germany had to basically come in, and France to a certain degree. This was before Brexit, so the UK to a certain degree, but Germany for the most part was holding it all together, paying everybody's bills, right, with tough austerity measures and everything else. You take a look at some of the debt levels of African countries even like Kenya, even South Africa, all these countries. That's a place where having a unified currency or a unified reserve or having a unified, I'm not say network, but a unified community
Hmm.
would be really cool. It would be needed as well. And having a centralized standard for the whole continent, the way Germany created one for the EU. Was it perfect? Of course not. Am I saying form one currency for the African continent? Of course not. I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying though is that in all these different countries, you've got deposits of natural resources from diamonds to precious metals to iron ore and everything else. They're not being pooled.
Mm.
If all these
Hmm.
countries pooled those resources and negotiated as one, could you imagine the type of agreements they could get through the
Right.
IMF? If they negotiated as one, could you imagine the type of terms they can get from the IMF? Terms that are not favorable at all. I mean, you're talking about countries like Kenya that are in default with several places, countries like Egypt that are almost in default, countries, South Africa's had its own issues as well, but you have some countries that have more than others. And what's happening right now is they're pointing at it and say, oh, look here, look, these guys don't have anything. Oh, no, we're better than them. South Africa has the ability to stand up as a voice and say, look at where we came from, especially considering Zimbabwe is now changing their currency and changing everything else and trying to become more stable. South Africa has the ability to stand up as a voice and say, look at what we accomplished. We
Hmm.
are the standard bearer, or we want to be the standard bearer. Are we perfect? Of course not, but we want to be the standard bearer. That could be the North Star, right? It's inclusive of tourism. It's inclusive of everything else, but you've got to have one voice. And right now, with a fractured ANC, you don't have one voice.
Yeah, I wondered if you have run across anyone or any group that you would
No,
identify as that potential voice.
no, and that's just it. And that's
Mm.
just it. Mandela was that voice. That's why he was that vessel, right?
Hmm.
Could you imagine if he was still alive today? First of all, he would be livid to see what's become of the politics of South Africa.
Mm.
But secondly, he would be looking at this as a means to become part of the international community as a powerful ally. Think about this, right? The most powerful countries in the world have gone in and basically economically colonized almost every country in Africa, whether it's China, whether it's the US, whether it's the UK, whether it's Indonesia, whether it's India, you name it. I
Hmm.
mean, a lot of it's China, obviously. And I'm not, again, as I said before, I'm not villainizing them. I'm not villainizing them. It's business, right? It's a business
Yeah.
sense. It's foreign policy. It's economic policy. But it's Africa for as a continent for decades now has been. I was reading an article I love in The Economist. This was from, gosh, probably 10, 15 years ago, that talked about that investment in Africa was the future. This is 15 years ago, and here we are, and sure enough, it is.
Mm.
Sure enough, it
Yeah.
is. It is where everybody's looking to invest. So what's stopping South Africa? And this is it, right? What's stopping South Africa from standing up and saying, okay, we are the flag bearer for or the standard bearer for this continent.
Mm.
We are helping to write a code of standard for every country neighboring to us and around us. They have to have the right vessel. They don't have one right now. Who is that vessel? I don't know, right? This is sometimes what happens with some of these countries, right? You have somebody like Mandela that is, for lack of better words, a legend,
Hmm.
but who takes his mantle afterwards?
Yeah.
Nobody. Nobody. And,
Mm.
and that's the problem, right? Whereas if you take a look, I'll be biased right now and talk about India. right? With Modi, Narendra Modi, and yes, he's polarizing. However, he has a mandate with his people. He has an absolute mandate
Hmm.
with the Indian people. Like him or not is irrelevant. That he has a mandate. He is a voice of the most populous country in the world. It's not, and he is a voice of them. And when he talks, people are now listening to
Hmm.
what he has to say. But same problem, right? But here's the thing: he
Yeah.
is identified that he's not going to be around forever. There has to be a way to carry on what he's starting. So if you listen to any of his talks, if you read anything he's written, he has always talked about not running and going and asking for help for the West, being able to be sustain yourselves the right way and doing it, whatever methods, right? And yes, you can argue some of the methods. You can argue that, okay, well, what about this and this violation, that violation? Okay, every country has those. But you understand that he's using his mandate to further the nationalism of his country. Who's doing that in South Africa?
Mm.
You have a president, yes. Is the country functioning? Absolutely.
Yeah.
But who's the flag? Who's furthering the nationalism of the country? And the unique aspect of South Africa is that they actually, I usually think Kenya could do it, but they just can't get out of their own way.
Mm.
But South Africa has the ability to stand up and say, we are the standard bearer for our continent. To just the same way you have NATO, you have ASEAN, you have the Pacific coalitions, you've got United Nations, you've got everything else. And you've got coalitions in Africa as well, continental country coalitions. You've got different organizations that have those, right? But the ability to stand up and say we stand for this,
Hmm.
right? We are the and I know what I'm saying is not foreign. A lot of people already know this, but I think it's just coming out and saying that what's missing is a vessel.
Hmm.
You have all these things in pieces. What's missing is a vessel. We had a vessel in Mandela when tourism was starting in South Africa. We had a vessel and he had a mandate. If you get a vessel, you'll be given a mandate,
Mm.
right? That's key, right? Take a look at our country. I'm not getting into politics. However, when you go back and you look at Dwight Eisenhower,
Hmm.
you look at FDR, those guys had mandates because of what was happening around them. They stood up
Yeah.
and they had a mandate, right? You could make an argument for Obama as well on his first term. You can make an argument for him in his first term, but what was happening around, right? What was happening around you? You take a look at UK right now. People are, you can debate about Rishi Sunak as the prime
Hmm.
minister of UK, whether he's good or bad. However, when he came after Theresa May, his first comment was "Told you so."
Uh,
And now the UK is about to actually start cutting rates because their economy is growing again,
mm.
right? It's getting
Yeah.
back on solid footing. This is the country that was completely lost. Everybody thought, Brexit was the worst decision they ever made, which could be argued as a reasonable argument, right? That it
Hmm.
was. But the fact that he had a mandate, whether he keeps one or not is irrelevant. The fact is he had a mandate.
Hmm.
You start looking at all of that, that becomes a key part of this, right? In terms of this. So you have to look at it from that standpoint. You have to look at it from the standpoint that flag bearer, the vessel, who is the flag bearer or
So
standard bearer?
let me ask you this. We can sit here and say that they need that. Do they think they need that?
Depends who you talk to.
Yeah.
It depends who you look. If you talk to, and I'll remember, I'll never forget, I talked to a GM of a particular hotel in Cape Town, and he's one of many I've talked to that agree that there needs to be one because they
Hmm.
keep talking. And see, and here's how you can tell that they agree with that. The ones who keep reminiscing about Mandela are the
Mm.
ones who are agreeing that they need that. The ones who complain about Ramaphosa, the ones who complain about the current, they don't know what they don't know, right? And that's
Mm.
and that's that's what it comes down to is no country knows they need that. India didn't know they needed that. They just knew they were tired of what they had in place,
Mm.
right? Why did FDR get elected to the third term, unprecedented third term? Everybody knew his health wasn't in the best of shape. If you read his biography, everybody can see that everybody knew that he was not in the best of health, but they gave him that mandate. Why? Think about that. Why would they do that? Right?
Yeah.
Is it continuity? Is it stability? Is it, what was the reason? Only president so far to have a third term in history.
Hmm. Yeah.
And look at our politics in this country right now. Do we know we need it?
Oh, yeah, I think so.
All right.
I would hope
But
so.
we're looking for it, but does everybody in the US know they need it? Does everybody in Canada know they need it? Does everybody in Mexico know they need it? Does everybody know they need it? Right? And that's the thing. I draw a correlation to Myanmar. Um, and this is where it fell off the rails, right? Everybody thought Aung San Suu Kyi was that person, right? When she was in the house arrest, everybody thought she was that person. She was the standard bearer. She was the vessel to get rid of the junta. Turns out she wasn't.
Right.
So that's the second part of this. You have to be sure.
Yeah. And you can't always be sure.
No, you can't. And so you go back to when Mandela became president. Nobody was sure. But somehow they started believing.
Yeah.
Right. I researched this, and I would urge you to do the same thing. I think you'll enjoy this. Look at the approval ratings of Mandela when he was president. From when he first came into office to even after he was president. Look at his approval rating when the World Cup in 1998 came, or 2008. I'm sorry, when the World Cup came to South Africa in 2008.
Yeah.
Look at his popularity, his ratings then versus when he first came into office. He didn't have that vessel to begin with. He wasn't that person. He just represented it, but he didn't have it. He had to sell the nation on it. Whether it was that Rugby World Cup that did it or the United Nations speech, but there was a series of events that led him to be the person that everybody talks about. Right? And it's huge. I mean, whether anytime you watch any documentary or read any biography about him, he's revered. But people forget that when he first came into office, he was hated. Not by his own people, but by everybody else because he represented a change.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's the work, right? You look at any of our campaigns here in the US, everything is change for good and change for that. I don't think our politicians understand how powerful the word change really is. Throwing it around like the way they do is pretty dangerous.
Yeah.
Whereas the person who doesn't actually say the word change but represents it is huge. So, I mean,
yeah. Right.
Think about this. So the country to watch right now very carefully is Indonesia, because they're quickly becoming a top 10 economy. And whether they know it or not, they do have a similar vessel right now. But they've got some things they got to work out, right? But they do have this. I think when you look at Argentina, Milei, is definitely not popular. But ask yourself this question. In 2 years, if Argentina is completely financially stable and is fiscally sound and is fiscally responsible and is no longer seen as the irresponsible child that spends all the money, would he have a mandate then? Would he be that standard bearer then? Would he be that vessel then? And I ask this because people say Winston Churchill was that vessel during World War II in the UK, right? In terms of galvanizing people. But his history before World War II in places like Egypt wasn't a good one.
Yeah.
He was an oppressor. But everybody forgot about that.
Yeah.
Right?
History is always kinder, right?
Right, exactly. But something happened, a catalyst. In that case, it was World War II. But something happened. It was a catalyst that actually led to him becoming that vessel. People saw Mandela as a terrorist before he was elected president. Right? And then he didn't become that vessel because he was elected. Something happened, whether it was a Rugby World Cup or whether it was a United Nations speech, something happened that turned the light switch on for everybody in South Africa to say, he's right. We need to be part of this international community. Otherwise, we're not going to survive financially. We need to be part of this in order to be able to thrive, because look at these sanctions on us and everything else. It's the same conversation that should be happening and likely is happening in Venezuela.
Yeah.
Who is that vessel? It's not Maduro. Who's that vessel? Right? Who is that? Who is that person? Who is going to be that vessel? It doesn't have to be a world leader. It doesn't have to be the president or prime minister. It could be something. Mandela became that vessel long after he was president, not before. A lot of people don't remember when he was in prison. People think, oh yes, we revered him in prison. Nobody really cared about him in prison, unfortunately. They had all forgotten about him in prison. It was afterwards when they heard his story that, oh, yes, 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 yes. Come on. What about Steve Biko? Steve Biko was actually killed in police custody in Johannesburg. He was equally involved in the movement of anti-apartheid. He became that bear. Now, whether he lived long enough, if he had lived long enough, would he have done something to undo it? For example, Martin Luther King. This is going to be controversial, so if I offend somebody, I'm not going to apologize because it's the truth. Look, take a look at Martin Luther King. Read his biography. Don't watch the movies. Read his biography. Read everything about him. He became that movement.
Yeah.
Everybody forgot about the fact that he had a mistress, that he was cheating on his wife.
Yeah.
Everybody forgot about that. So that became part of it.
Yeah.
So that's key, right?
Yeah.
So nobody's perfect. Nobody's gonna be perfect. Nobody's going to be perfect. Nobody's going to be, you know, nobody's going to basically be able to come and say, this person's a saint. Modi's not perfect.
Right.
FDR wasn't perfect.
Right.
No, nobody is. Winston Churchill wasn't perfect. Nobody is. But you have to have that vessel. Mandela wasn't perfect. But you have to have that vessel. Right? You have to have that vessel that comes in. Even Mahatma Gandhi now, you start listening to certain things, maybe, you know, and you start thinking, okay, well, maybe he wasn't totally perfect either.
Yeah.
Right? And that's normal, right? That's human.
Right.
But it still became a vessel.
Right.
And I think that's the thing that's really key is I think South Africa has to find that vessel, the next vessel to be able to actually you're smiling ear to ear. What?
Because I'm just sitting here thinking, well, maybe it's you, Ashish.
No, definitely not me. This podcast is the vessel, right? I mean, think about this.
Yeah.
You and I would never have been able to have this conversation just me. But because you and I are on this podcast together, this conversation came up. And, you know, look, our listener base is growing so quickly. You saw it. It's growing so quickly. So clearly our message is resonating.
Yeah.
You know, and it's you know, it's small successes or big successes in small places.
Mm-hmm.
And that successes don't always have to deal with a person. It could be an ideology. Here we're talking about a vessel.
Yeah.
A vessel for an ideology, right? We've established tourism in South Africa. It is popular. The South Africa Tourism Board, which honestly, if I can jump on my soapbox for a second, hey, Peru, can you please talk to South Africa and see how it's actually done? Because that's an effective tourist board. They do a great job.
What would a podcast be if we didn't bring
if we didn't bash the ministers of tourism? You know what? It's going to become my thing. I'm going to start counting days that I have to say something. But seriously, right? So tourism is established. There is tons of investment coming into South Africa. It is one of their biggest exports, obviously. Mm-hmm. There's new lodges opening different places. There's responsible tourism occurring in different places. It's being done in a careful manner. Is it perfect? Of course not. But you're seeing this just emergence and just skyrocketing for South Africa in terms of where their ascent is. And with that ascent comes a platform. Right? Yeah. With that ascent comes a huge platform, and that's the key.
Yeah. So we're talking about South Africa next time as well, yeah?
Yes, we are.
Storytelling through food.
Oh, I can't wait for this one. It actually is going to be delving into some of the food stuff we were talking about with Mandela's chef.
Oh, good.
And it's, you know, and it's not in South Africa, but it applies to other places as well. You can learn so much about food. I'll tie in my favorite restaurant in Kenya as well with one of my favorite experiences in South Africa. So the person who do these tours, those local chefs who do this, they're amazing. Absolutely amazing. So
that's awesome. I'm excited.
Maybe they're the vessel.
Maybe they are. Food is such a binder, you know.
All I know is I'm hungry.
I am too. Maybe it's time to wrap it up.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. But you're right. Food is it's a binder. It really is. There's a story that's told that I apologize to every museum curator who's listening right now. I'm not a big museum person. I'm just not.
I'm not.
Okay, you admitted it too. Good.
Okay. I try. I do better if I've discovered I do better if I have a guide, but turning me loose in a museum by myself,
No, I mean,
Like
you
my
take it
brain
in.
shuts off. I can't.
Yeah, it's like a
I can't
data
even read.
overload.
Yeah, it's
Yeah, it's a data exactly. It's a data overload.
yeah,
I'm more living history. I'd like to be, and food is that living history.
yeah, for sure.
And history doesn't mean hundreds of years ago. History could mean 20 years ago, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
You look back at the last 50 years, at 51 years, just because of going back, and my father talked about this. Look at all the things that we have been through as a society over the last 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
We have rewritten the history books 3 times over. When you and I were in school, things like the pandemic didn't exist, the terrorist attacks, and our definition of terrorist attack was Pearl Harbor,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
It was not what happened in New York, right?
Yeah.
So
Right.
there was that. Our definition of a pandemic, just the last thing we talked about was the was it the plague, and that was going back how far, right? And
Oh, yeah.
tuberculosis and
Yeah.
everything else. So you now, when would that have occurred? Elections that were disputed, that would end up
Mm-hmm.
in the courts, and where you didn't have elections where you didn't have a clean transfer of power.
Mm-hmm.
These are all things that, good or bad, they rewrote the history books. I
Yeah,
tell my children all the time. I tell my daughter in particular, who's 12, I said, the history books that you read are going to look very different than the history books that I read, because we've
for sure.
rewritten them. And I told her it's very important when you read these parts. And so we have conversations. She told her teacher about how she was in Peru last year with us and what she went through and what she saw there. I was explaining to her, I said, it's very important that when you come across these things that are modern history for the last 50 years, come home and talk about it, because then I'll be able to tell you where you were, even though whether you were 5, 6, or 7 when that happened. So when you have kids and grandkids, you'll be able to tell them
Yeah.
uh, about this point, the way our grandparents told us and our ancestors told us about World War II and told
Yeah.
us about the Great Depression.
Which I think is even more important. This oral history is even more important than ever in this world of
Yeah,
AI, where
yeah,
we can't be sure soon, won't be able to be sure and validate
right,
truth. It's
right,
going to be harder and harder.
exactly, exactly.
So,
So
mm.
exciting.
All right,
All
cool. Well,
right,
I'm excited, and
absolutely. I'm hungry.
yeah, me too. Yeah.
So we're going to be talking about South Africa next week, but our next episode. But thank you so much, Leigh. Thank you for being on this journey with me, and to all of our listeners as well. Thank you for listening. Thank you for subscribing. Thank you for helping this podcast grow at the level it is.
Yeah, we do. We thank you so much. Yeah.
Absolutely.
All
Till next
right. Till
time.
next. Yep. Till next time.
Thank you for listening to The Sustainable Voice. If you have a success story of your own, please reach out and share it with us.